They raised my HOA fees for having the wrong color house, but the color was perfectly legal. Imagine their faces when they found out the man they were messing with secretly owned the entire neighborhood. How far would you go if the people fining you didn't even own the homes they lived in? Welcome to my channel. If you love HOA revenge stories, hit that subscribe button and let's begin. I had lived in the house for barely 2 weeks when the first violation notice showed up. It was taped to my front door like a scarlet letter, bright orange and impossible to miss. Exterior paint color non-compliant, $250 fine. It read in bold, aggressive lettering. I stood there, stunned, with a half-unpacked box in my arms. I had just spent $12,000 repainting the house before moving in, matching it exactly to the HOA's official palette. My contractor had even gotten written approval from the architectural committee, signed and stamped with Karen's initials, before a single drop of paint hit the siding. So, what the hell was this? That evening, I marched into the HOA office with the paperwork in hand, determined to sort it out. Karen Mitchell sat behind the desk like she was presiding over a royal court. She didn't look up when I laid the approval form on the counter. Yes, well, we've had some changes since then, she said, flipping through her pink leather planner like it contained state secrets. The board recently voted to remove Sagewood Olive from the acceptable color list. That was the name of my house color. You can't retroactively ban a color after approving it, I said, trying to keep my voice level. That's not how this works. Karen looked up finally, her eyes hard. The community voted. You can appeal at the next meeting, but the fine stands, and additional penalties will be assessed for non-compliance. Then she smiled, like she just told me the weather. I walked out of that office with a storm brewing inside me. 2 days later, another notice arrived. Continued violation, daily fine of $100 until resolved. My inbox exploded with HOA emails, each more passive-aggressive than the last. I attended the next board meeting, bringing every shred of documentation I had. I expected some kind of compromise, or at least a fair hearing. Instead, Karen ran the meeting like a courtroom drama. Rules are rules, she repeated every time I spoke. Exceptions are not precedent. When I pointed out that 3 other homes on the same block were painted the exact same shade of green, she shrugged. Aesthetic inconsistency depends on location and lighting. We have to maintain visual harmony. Her cronies on the board, all too eager to agree with her, nodded like bobbleheads. They voted to deny my appeal unanimously. I walked out to a round of whispers from neighbors who wouldn't meet my eyes. Then, the real harassment began. My mailbox was stuffed with violation letters nearly every morning. I was fined for weeds that didn't exist, for a trash can left out that wasn't mine, and once even for unauthorized patio furniture, a single wooden bench that had been there since the last owner. Then came the fee increase. I logged into the HOA portal one morning to pay my dues, and found that mine had been raised from $165 to $450 per month. I contacted the management company, who replied with a boilerplate message. Certain properties deemed high maintenance may be subject to adjusted dues. My jaw hit the floor. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded that day when I posted screenshots. That's when the messages started trickling in. Hey, just wanted to say Karen did this to us too. I used to live on Oak Hollow. They fined me into foreclosure. They made my parents repaint their whole house, twice. I received nearly a dozen messages from former homeowners who had quietly left or been pushed out after similar battles. Each one followed a familiar pattern. Petty violations, escalating fines, then legal threats about liens and property seizures. One elderly woman told me she had sold her home and moved in with her daughter after Karen threatened to garnish her Social Security checks. Another man said he lost his renters when the HOA refused to approve their vehicle permits because his truck had company branding on the side. The more I heard, the more it became clear. This wasn't about a paint color. It was a pattern, a system, a racket. Karen didn't enforce the rules equally. She used them like weapons. And if she had a personal issue with you, God help you. She could quote the bylaws like scripture, twisting vague clauses into fines and fees that bled homeowners dry. And the board? They were either in on it or too cowardly to challenge her. I found myself going to bed angry, waking up angrier, my brain spinning with unanswered questions. Why me? Why now? What was really going on here? That's when I started digging. I pulled the property records for my own home, then for Karen's, then for every board member's closkin. I noticed something strange. The board members had all purchased their homes within the same 3-year period, and for suspiciously low prices, like significantly below market rate. I pulled their sale records, zoning history, and HOA meeting minutes. I combed through budget reports buried on the community website. That's when things started to click. There were irregularities everywhere, duplicate vendor payments, landscaping invoices with no matching work orders, legal consultation fees paid monthly to a firm that didn't even exist in the State Bar database. I compiled everything into a spreadsheet, highlighting every instance of shady activity. The deeper I went, the worse it got. Then I stumbled onto the bombshell. In the HOA's annual budget, I found line items labeled maintenance adjustment, tied to certain addresses, mine included. When I cross-referenced them with property records, a pattern emerged. The higher the homeowner's resistance to HOA actions, the higher their adjusted fees became. It was targeted, deliberate, and illegal. But the most alarming thing of all, I found that Karen herself didn't even own her house. It was owned by a holding company called Sunrise Ridge Properties, LLC. Curious, I searched the LLC through the Secretary of State's website. It was registered under an agent name I didn't recognize, but I wasn't done yet. I dug deeper, looking into the LLC's other holdings. That's when the truth hit me like a freight train. Sunrise Ridge Properties owned not just Karen's house, but 5 other properties in the neighborhood. Then I found another LLC, Maplestone Developments LLC, that owned 2 more. Different names, different addresses. But when I followed the paper trail far enough, they all led to the same source. Same mailing address, same financial manager, same last name as mine. That's when I called my father. Dad, I asked carefully, have you ever heard of Sunrise Ridge Properties? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Why are you asking that? He finally replied. Because, I said slowly, I think you own half my neighborhood. He sighed, long and heavy. Well, he said, I wasn't planning to tell you, not yet. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at the monitor, all the puzzle pieces clicking together. The violation notices, the retaliation, the fake legal threats, the inflated dues. All of it was part of something bigger. Karen thought she could bleed me dry and run me out like the others. But what she didn't know was that the man she was trying to bully was the son of the man who quietly owned the very land under her feet, and she had just declared war on the wrong family. I didn't sleep the night I discovered my father's name connected to those LLCs. My mind churned through every conversation we'd ever had about investments, real estate, or retirement planning. He'd always been vague, talking about long-term property plays and asset protection structures, but I never thought he meant my neighborhood. The next morning, I drove to his office without calling ahead. He greeted me like nothing was out of the ordinary, even offered me a cup of coffee like we were about to talk football. So, I began, not even sitting down, how many houses do you own in Willow Bend Estates? He didn't flinch. He just looked up over his glasses and said, do you want the number by name or by LLC? My jaw clenched. The board is trying to find me out of the neighborhood over a paint color. I've got neighbors being pushed into bankruptcy. And you're telling me you own most of the street? He set his mug down slowly. I didn't mean to keep it from you, but I wasn't ready to tell you either. I've been building this for 15 years. He pulled open a drawer and laid out a file that looked like a war plan. Inside were spreadsheets, LLC filings, land trust documents, and property deeds. Dozens of them. Each property tied to a different shell company with names like Cypress Ridge Holdings, Westlake Row LLC, and Harborview Partners. They were all tied to different P.O. boxes, different registered agents, different addresses, but they were all him. And through them, he owned house after house in Willow Bend. You know, he said, when we started, I didn't even realize this neighborhood had an HOA. I just liked the development, clean, newer homes, good schools nearby. So I bought a few and rented them out, quietly, spread across LLCs for liability reasons. But then I noticed the turnover. People getting pushed out, petty fines, foreclosures. So I kept buying. I sat down across from him, stunned. Why didn't you stop them? He looked at me, serious now. Because it wasn't time. I was still accumulating. And because if I challenged the HOA too early, they would have locked me out, changed the bylaws, passed ownership minimums. I had to let them believe they were in charge. My head spun. How many do you own? He paused. Directly or through proxies? Both. He leaned back. As of last week, 71 homes. Out of 101. I blinked. You own 70% of this entire neighborhood. He nodded. Including the homes that Karen and 3 of the board members currently live in. They're renters. Month-to-month leases under dummy property managers. They don't even realize it. I couldn't believe it. The same people threatening liens on my house, the same people who mocked me in meetings and called me combative, didn't even own the keys to the homes they lived in. They were tenants, pretending to rule a kingdom that belonged to someone else. The next day, I brought in a real estate attorney, Shannon Lee, a tough-as-nails property specialist who'd helped me through a nasty zoning battle years ago. She reviewed my father's files in silence for almost 2 hours, then closed the folder and said, "You've got them. And not just for fraud. This is full-scale misrepresentation." We started digging deeper. Shannon requested all HOA voting records for the past 5 years. Under most state HOA laws, only owners of record are allowed to serve on the board. Yet here were Karen and her loyal foot soldiers, Bob Green, Susan Latimer, and Hal Foster, all casting votes and issuing fines under the assumption they had ownership rights. Shannon confirmed what my dad suspected. Not one of them had ever legally owned their home. Each property title showed leased residence, registered under his LLCs, with no purchase or mortgage attached. It got worse. When we pulled the HOA's articles of incorporation and bylaws from the state's nonprofit records, Shannon noticed something damning. "See this clause?" she said, pointing to a line buried halfway down the page. Any HOA action, including elections, budgets, or new rule proposals, requires quorum approval by majority owners, not board members. Property owners. She flipped through the previous meeting minutes, pointing to dates, votes, and signatures. They've been issuing enforcement rulings illegally for years. They had no legal standing to vote. And with your father controlling over 70% of the neighborhood's real estate, that means every action they've taken in the last 18 months is invalid. I leaned forward. "So what does that mean? For me? For them?" Shannon smiled. "It means we're going to dismantle them brick by brick." The next 2 weeks were a blur of planning. My father and I worked with Shannon to prepare the paperwork needed to assert ownership control. We sent formal notices to the HOA management company, demanding a halt on all enforcement actions pending a forensic audit. We filed ownership declarations with the county, correcting the public record and listing each LLC as a controlled entity of one individual, my father. We sent demand letters to Karen and the other board members, informing them that their tenancy was being reclassified and that their right to serve on the board had been suspended under Section 5.2 of the HOA's own bylaws. And best of all, we sent notices to every single homeowner in the neighborhood, explaining in plain language that the HOA's authority had been invalidated due to non-compliant leadership and lack of ownership representation. The reaction was swift. Karen called an emergency board meeting 2 days later and tried to hold it in the community clubhouse. But the doors were locked with a legal notice taped to the glass, closed pending ownership verification and financial review. She tried to move the meeting to her house, but my father's property manager hand-delivered a lease termination notice that morning, giving her 30 days to vacate the premises. Susan Latimer posted a furious rant in the Facebook group that afternoon, only for Shannon to reply with scanned copies of her lease, HOA voting laws, and the termination clause she'd signed 2 years earlier. Hal and Bob simply disappeared. I heard Bob had started working night shifts at a security company and moved out the following weekend. Hal tried to claim he had verbal ownership rights through a rent-to-own agreement. Shannon shut that down in a single letter. The neighborhood began to turn. People who had kept their heads down during Karen's reign of petty fines and threats started emailing me, thanking me. One man said he could finally plant a tree in his front yard without being told it was not on the approved flora list. A woman wrote that she hadn't painted her shutters in years because she feared another $500 color harmony violation. Now, she said, I'm going turquoise. My father and I weren't just dismantling the board, we were restoring sanity. Shannon finalized the paperwork to initiate a vote of no confidence. With our controlling ownership, it was a formality. Karen's HOA was legally dissolved in 10 minutes. We filed the termination with the state and sent the official dissolution to the management company, who gratefully terminated their contract. Karen had called them 15 times in a single day, demanding they block our actions. But the moment they saw our ownership numbers, they ghosted her. With the HOA dead, my father and I prepared something better. We created a new neighborhood advisory council, one that didn't issue fines, didn't police mailboxes, and didn't care about what shade your shutters were. We opened it to volunteers. People stepped forward, people who actually lived in their homes, not in fear. Karen tried to call a lawyer. She filed a complaint with the State Board of Homeowners Associations, but when they saw the ownership filings and the tenant status of her board, they declined to take action. She disappeared a week later. Her car was gone. Her blinds were shut. The U-Haul came the following Saturday. I watched from my porch as movers carried out her designer chairs and boxes of files she never had the right to keep. The last time I saw her, she was standing in her doorway, staring at the street she once ruled. She didn't wave. She didn't glare. She just got in the car and left. It was a Wednesday when the final threat arrived, and Karen, in true villain fashion, didn't even bother to hide it. A letter slid under my door in a crisp white envelope, stamped with the now fading seal of the HOA. Inside was a 2-page notice that read like a declaration of war. The first paragraph cited continued non-compliance for unauthorized exterior paint tone. The second paragraph detailed remedial action to be taken by the HOA within 7 days, including painting over my home at my own expense. $6,400 billed to me if I didn't comply. The third paragraph, printed in bold, warned of a pending lien to be placed against my home if I failed to pay the accumulated fines, which now totaled over $8,000. I sat at my kitchen table, reading it under the soft buzz of the ceiling light, and let out a quiet laugh. They had no idea, not a clue what was coming. I showed the letter to Shannon, my attorney, and she smiled like a wolf sniffing blood. "Perfect," she said, pulling out a folder thick with printed emails, property records, and lease agreements. "This gives us everything we need. They're still acting like they have legal authority, and now they've tried to threaten property damage and extortion on top of it." She handed me a stapled packet. "Let's burn it all down." We scheduled the neighborhood's next open meeting, the final one Karen would ever attend, and made sure everyone knew it. We posted signs around the neighborhood. We emailed residents. Shannon even printed postcards and hand-delivered them door to door. Neighborhood Transparency Night. Find out who really owns Willow Bend. That got people's attention. By the time the meeting rolled around, the community clubhouse was packed wall to wall. I saw faces I hadn't seen in weeks, some tight with anger, others wide-eyed with hope. Karen was seated at the front table, flanked by her ever-loyal minions, Susan and Bob. Karen wore her signature blazer, her heels tapped impatiently against the polished tile. She thought this was another chance to put me in my place. I walked in with a laptop under one arm and a thick folder under the other. My father walked beside me, calm and collected in a gray tailored suit, looking like a man walking into his own boardroom. Shannon followed behind us with a rolling briefcase full of receipts, legal filings, and signed affidavits from residents who had been harassed, fined, or threatened. We were not just ready, we were loaded. Karen cleared her throat into the mic. "Tonight's meeting will begin with enforcement updates. First order of business, house color violations. Specifically the home at 14 Sycamore. Actually," I said loudly from the crowd, walking toward the front, "we're going to start with a brief presentation on ownership. Because before anyone here gets fined, harassed, or painted over, they deserve to know who actually has the legal right to run this neighborhood." Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're not recognized to speak," she said, gripping the mic. "You don't set the agenda." I smiled. "That's funny, because according to the bylaws, which require board actions be conducted by legal property owners, you don't either." I plugged in the laptop to the projector. The first slide appeared. Willow Bend Estates. Ownership analysis. Slide 2. A breakdown of homes by legal owner. Slide 3. A list of every board member's address, matched to LLC ownership records, none of them in their name. The room went silent. Karen Mitchell, I said, reading off the screen, currently resides in 402 Brookstone Lane. The legal owner of record, Sunrise Ridge Properties, LLC. I clicked. A scanned deed appeared. Registered to a P.O. box in Tennessee, managed by this man, my father. I gestured beside me. My dad stepped forward. "Good evening," he said to the stunned room. "I'm the legal owner of 71 homes in this neighborhood, including the ones occupied by your entire HOA board." The room exploded. People whispered, gasped, and turned to each other. Karen stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. "This is an ambush! This is fabricated!" she shouted. I clicked again. Slide 4. A video. Footage from a Ring camera showed Karen berating a resident for a violation. In the background, Susan could be seen measuring a shrub with a tape measure. The next clip showed Bob slipping an anonymous fine under a door at 2 a.m. The video was time-stamped. The resident was in the hospital that week. We showed footage of Karen mocking homeowners during a private Zoom call, clips we'd obtained from a whistleblower. Then we played the final piece, audio of a phone call Karen made to the HOA management company, demanding that certain residents get priced out for neighborhood integrity. My father stepped to the mic. "Under Section 8 of the HOA bylaws, only property owners may serve on the board. As majority owner, I am formally terminating this board, effective immediately." Shannon handed each board member a formal letter of termination, along with a lease revocation notice for each of their homes. Karen sputtered. You can't evict me." My father smiled. "Actually, I can. Your lease was under a month-to-month arrangement through a property management firm you never bothered to research. I own that home. You have 30 days to vacate." Susan collapsed into her chair. Bob looked like he was about to throw up. That's when it all came pouring out. One woman in the back raised her hand. "They fined me $200 for having a flag on my porch during Veterans Day." Another man stood up. "They tried to evict my renters because their car didn't match the aesthetic." A woman choked back tears as she said, "They told my mother her wheelchair ramp was an unauthorized structure." The entire room turned against the former board in real time. People who had suffered quietly now spoke freely. Years of tyranny were being aired out like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. Shannon passed out copies of a full forensic report showing misused HOA funds. Over $180,000 spent on beautification projects that never happened. Another $45,000 labeled consulting fees sent to shell companies linked to Karen's cousin. It was all there, black and white. The management company rep stood up. "We're terminating our contract with the HOA effective immediately," she said, her voice shaking. "We had no idea these board members weren't legal owners. This was a breach of contract and trust." My father took the mic one final time. "Moving forward, this community will be governed by a homeowner advisory council composed entirely of actual property owners. Participation is optional. There will be no fines, no forced compliance, no aesthetic enforcement." The room erupted in applause. People stood, clapped, some cried. I saw neighbors shake hands for the first time in years. Karen gathered her papers in silence. No one stopped her. No one thanked her. She walked out of that clubhouse with her head down and her legacy in ruins. 3 weeks later, her house was empty. The blinds were drawn. A foreclosure notice had been stapled to the front door. Rumor had it she tried to sue. The case was thrown out before it made it to court. Bob and Susan were gone too. New families moved in. No one brought up HOA rules again. And me? I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, in front of my perfectly painted, legally approved house. A breeze rustled the trees as a few kids rode bikes down the now rule-free street. A wooden sign hung from my porch rail, carved by hand and hung with pride. It read simply, "No OA. Owner, me." The peace was real. The war was over, and I had won.